My name is Victor. Good morning, everyone. Got a pretty busy day today. Hope everyone's doing well. All right, so quickly, this is what I look like. So in lieu of camera, there's a long journey that I went through, and I enjoyed IT quite a bit. So that's just me there. You are Clay Victor Chin. Great. All right, so folks, today's agenda, we're going to look at how we can make use of OAuth to protect our web API. Now, we're going to be looking at how Azure AD can help us issuing the tokens and basically help us operate at the scale of the internet. Now, this talk is structured around using Azure AD as the directory service. So we're going to start by looking at how Azure AD is being the critical component. Okay, so folks, since everyone is here, must already have a background in development. So today's sample will be built based on Node.js and ASP.NET Web API. Okay, and we'll also see ASP.NET Core website interacting with our Web API. Okay. Now today, I know I personally have been working with web-based services since the ASPX days, since the ASMX days. So over the last 20 years or so, most of our softwares are now becomes service oriented. So in other words, not just that our software is a service, now we are building services as our product that we sell. So things like Twilio, things like SendGrid, these are really all functionalities that we use to sell as part of our offering to our customers. All right. So today we're going to break down our journey into 4 parts. So the first part is I will show you a web API built on the ASP.NET Core framework. Now, we know ASP.NET Core use the middleware heavily. So the very first project we'll be looking at is a backend API, and we're going to use the authorization attribute to demand a JWT token be presented in order to invoke these web APIs. Now, in order for our application to recognize and accept the claims, now we must register all the players into this OAuth system. I think one of the biggest challenge and the biggest part to understand in this talk is that there are going to be many players. Okay, we have players, for example, Web API. Web API is a relying party based on Azure AD. We have identity stores, ID server. Now these ID servers where all the identities are kept. Web API, users, apps, all kinds of apps, and their permission to access the APIs. These are all registered within a directory security system. So phase 2, we will look at how to register these as relying party, and I will point out some of the user interfaces within Azure AD. Now, please keep in mind that you may not wind up using Azure AD, okay, but the process is going to be more or less the same. You must register the relying party, and these parties must have some way of identifying themselves. All right. Now, once we get through that, we are going to move on to use the various library that Microsoft provides, the MSOL library to work with tokens. Okay, so we'll see a JS-based sample that obtains the token, actually that signs user in and then obtain the token in order to access those web APIs. Now, at the end, I will show you ASP.NET Core web-based app. Now, this web app not only signs user in, It will call Microsoft Graph to access things like emails and profile info. And the web app will also obtain tokens in order to call the backend API. All right. All right. So in order for this system to work, we have to understand the way that Azure Active Directory operate as our central gatekeeper. Now, within this directory service, there are many kind of security, many different types of security principles, including users, machines, and applications. So this centralized directory services knows the different apps. What API do they expose and what API they should have access to. Okay. All right. So this application here called OPS API represents a backend API that I rely on Azure AD to decide whether a token should be issued or a token that shouldn't be issued. So coming back to token, I just want to give you a quick analogy. Okay. So let's say this is DMV. DMV issues a driver's license. Now this driver license is then presented, for instance, to make a purchase buy beer. Okay. Now understand the bartender will take your driver's license. Now because the driver license itself is fairly, let's hope they have some kind of anti-forgery capability, right? So once the bartender receives the driver's license, the bartender can make a determination. Number one, is it genuine? And two, let me use the claims on the driver's license. So in this case, you notice that the bartender do not actually go out and call back to the DMV at that point to say, hey, I have this ID on hand, is this real? Usually that's not what happened. The bartender must first somehow verify, that the driver license is real. And once that can be determined, we are just going to use the claims. And that claim specifically will have date of birth. And then the bartender decides to dispense beer or not based on the claim on that driver's license. So Azure AD is that central trusted source. Our web API will be served as bartender. Now the users that holds on to the driver license are basically different kinds of apps. We have web apps, we have console apps, we have service apps, we have desktop apps, kiosks. So the different types of app all have different kind of OAuth flow in order to obtain the driver's license. Okay, so this driver license is also known as JWT, JSON Web Token. All right, so the minor difference here is that in real world, driver license do not have a targeted audience. So that means a police officer can use it to give you traffic tickets. Okay, a bartender can use it to dispense beer. So there's no specific audience in mind. But in the OAuth world, it is imperative that AAD only gives out these tokens when it knows who the audience is. So in other words, when my web app want to make a call to the web API, my web app has to ask AAD, can I have a token today to be used specifically for this web API. Okay. Now, if AAD is able to obtain the consent and is aware of these API being permission being allowed, or in other words, consented, then AAD will go ahead and sign a JWT token, which the client can then deliver to the web API in order to consume its service. Okay, so this is just trying to compare the analogy of real world versus how we work using OAuth, which is what we're talking about here today. Now, every application, so think of this guy as a bartender. He has a critical service of some sort. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is register an application. The end result of registering an application is that we obtain an application ID. So when the Web API middleware receives a request, we must verify, do you have a JWT? And if you do, is that for us? Is that for this application? Okay. Now, when we register the application, we will declare what API does our service expose. Now, in the OAuth lingo, we call it the scope. So this scope typically maps to what the API will offer. So my API will offer a query all, verify of check if it's good or it will bounce, or someone that can query their own thing. Now, these are all free-formed, so you can add a scope whenever you like. Okay, so for example, I will create a scope called deposit. That would be the scope name. Okay, now as you define the scope, you can choose whether this scope must be consented by the admin of a directory. That's the directory. And this is where how you could find directories. Okay. So this is the Microsoft Azure AD's implementation. So when you declare an API, you can have an admin of a directory that consented on the behalf of the rest of the organization, or the user can consent it themselves. Okay, so in here, I have 3 scopes already declared. Okay, verify check, query their own data, and query all data. Okay. Now, if I would continue on, so once I have this API, this is the source code of that API. Okay. So I'm going to take a moment and walk you through how the middleware in this web API integrate with the application I just registered. So in other words, this API will operate as the identity you just saw. Okay, so as we know, every ASP.NET course starts with a startup. Okay. So I'm going to use this to ensure my API accept AD bearers token. The option then binds to the Azure AD instance, my client ID, and my tenant ID. Okay. Now I can use this client ID as you see here. Later on, you'll see me using GUID. Either one is fine. Azure will translate either one. So notice I'm using this ID URI, but I could equally use this application ID. They all translate to the same thing, as long as they're globally unique. Okay. All right. So in this API, I have a controller, and the controller is my API controller. Okay. So I have a couple of methods that's marked as authorized. Okay. Get balance. Okay. The authorized attribute works with the middleware to ensure that anyone who is going to access these actions must obtain a bearer's token. Okay. All right. Now you also notice that I have added use authentication and use authorization. You must have these two middleware added. Now this part is the section about ASP.NET Identity. So I'm not going to focus on the ASP.NET Identity part. Okay, so I will focus on the authorization aspect of things. Now you also know that I have a bunch of cores because I have a JSON client that will call this. So I need to make sure core is addressed. All right. So here's bank controller. I have a helper method. So in other words, this helper method is simply checking from the HTTP context if the user has a scope claim. So in other words, the machine that whoever is calling me, whoever is trying to invoke me, whether it's JavaScript apps or it's a desktop app or a web app, whoever calls me must present a JSON Web Token. The middleware will verify the token is genuine. And then once the token is verified, the middleware will then construct a user object full of all kinds of claims. Okay. And these claims are then searched against to see, hey, is the balance.queryAll part of the scope claim? All right. Now, if the permission carries a claim called queryAll, I'm going to return an array of accounts, pretend this is all the account there are. Now, otherwise, if you just have queryOwn, we will return the user's own identity. So essentially echoing back who's calling. Okay, so you notice over here, the owner name simply an echo back based on the user's identity. Okay. So this part, and I also have a quick one that doesn't have authorization attribute to make sure everything works. All right. So in terms of protecting this API, there are two things. Number one, we need to declare that we are going to participate in an OAuth workflow by registering an application. Today's demo, I'm using Azure AD. Okay, if you want to run this thing entirely off of the Microsoft Cloud and host it yourself, there is a identity server package that you can run and be your own identity server. Okay, but the gist is pretty much the same. Okay. Now, folks, towards the end of the 45 minutes, I'll open up the floor for Q&As, and along as well as showing you guys where this repository, whereby code lives. So if you want to take a copy of this code and take a look at it, okay, all the code I'm demoing is available. Okay, so all right. Now I have this app service running. Okay, so I already published this to the website marseilleapi.azurewebsites.net. Okay. So the very first part, we have completed the web API registration. Okay. We declare some scopes as the securables within our API. Now, the client to this web API will need to have permission. Okay. So in the next part, I'll show you what that looks like. All right, so in this diagram, the OAuth 2 Code Grant is one of the many workflows. Now, the end user first by trying to access a web app. Now, this first part on the left in the gray area, this handles the authentication aspect of things. And it's meant to establish interactive users identity. So understand this part on the left, whether or not an API call is eventually made. This part usually have to take place securely to identify who it is that we are interacting with. So in this event, notice the user must somehow prove its identity against the web app. Okay, so users typically authenticate to Azure AD in order to answer the challenge. Now that challenge can be in the form of MFA, conditional access, all the other things. And then we have a ID token. Now folks, I must emphasize, this is only an ID token typically. This ID token alone is enough to allow the web app to ascertain the identity of that user. If the web app needs to further call out to other resources. Now understand that this web application will then need to ask for an access token. Now these access tokens are typically short-lived. Okay, they only live about an hour or so and they need to be refreshed. Okay, now part of that step 6, okay, this web app needs to prove its identity by using either a secret or certificate. Okay. So that way, what Azure AD knows, Victor grants app X to call API Y. So in this story, in this sentence, Victor has logged in, so we know Victor's identity. Now, application X wants a token to call app Y on behalf of Victor. So that means the application X also must prove its identity because Victor, as a human, already signed in, so we know who he is. Now the app X will exchange that authorization code into an access token. The access token can then be used to invoke the web API. All right, so this is the code grant workflow, provided this client is a trusted client, okay, confidential client. So there's a way to store these secrets. Right. So there'll be 3 technologies in today's talk: ASP.NET Identity, which is the authentication and authorization framework. MSOL library is the token handling. The keyword here is its job is to obtain token. Its job is not to sign people in or any other funny business, because those are taken care of each language platform. Okay. And the Microsoft Identity Web essentially is a wrapper for the MSOL library on the .NET Core. .NET Core framework. All right. So there are 3 technologies. Okay. ASP.NET Identity is the middleware. MSOL library is the language-dependent implementation of token handling. So this is the library that finds out if the token is genuine, okay, and parses out those URL requests to the Azure AD. While this is a convenience library specifically for the Microsoft folks, okay, for us Microsoft developers. Okay. All right. All right. So folks, earlier we saw how the web API is registered. So I'm going to review this one more time. Okay. You will come to Azure AD, go to app registration, and go to new registration. Okay. And once the application registration is done, you have the necessary parameter to configure the middleware, namely the application ID. Now you may notice that our web API does not actually contain a secret because our web API is not going to further call anyone else. This API is a pure consumer. Okay, so this is purely protected API. We are not chaining it to downstream API. If we do, then we also need to give this API a secret to identify itself. But for our demonstration, our API is solely protected. So it's essentially only a consumer of the system. It doesn't need its own proof. So notice certificate and secrets are empty. Okay. Now we did expose an API with various permissions. All right. Okay. Now, as far as the token configuration, you'll notice that token configuration have the possibility for you to say, I would like to add additional claims. Okay. Now, usually, because the way we are distributing our data through Microsoft Graph, most of the times we expect the recipient to go query the graph themselves. Okay. But sometimes, for convenience sake, you may want to include additional claims your API can make use of without making another call to Microsoft Graph. All right. All right, so we create that. We declare resource and permissions. Okay, these are in the form of scope. All right. Now, if we want our web API to access other things, we may. Now, this is what we need to do then. If we want this to have access to other API, we can configure it right here. So our API can call downstream APIs. But also remember, once you do this, the only way for this app to receive a token is that it has a way to identify itself. So we got to go back to the certificate and secret after we grant these API permissions. Okay. All right. So first, in order to consume this API, we have to understand there are two kinds of client. A client that we consider public. Okay. Single page app, desktop, mobile, and headless. These kind of apps, because they are installed on end user's computer or run in the browser, we cannot expect any secret or certificate to truly be secured. Okay, so if you embed some secret material in JavaScript, people can pull them out. Okay, if you put a secret in the exe, people can pull them out. So in those public clients, the application do not prove their identity. Only the users do. The users will interactively obtain the token, and the app will simply use it without questioning and send it to the backend. Okay. A confidential client, which is things like server-based web apps that you build with .NET Core. Okay. The user will use a browser, and it is the server that makes call to the web API. Now, in this type of confidential client, okay, this app must prove its identity. Okay. And also, this type of client can operate independent of any interactive user. So it is possible for confidential client to be a Windows background service that runs once a day and obtain a token on its own and send it to the web API. Okay, so it's possible because they have their own identity. Okay. All right. So with the MSOL library, we can incorporate that to a public client. I will be showing you a JavaScript-based client. Okay. All right. Now there are many ways to do it, including pass on the username and password, but it's a possible security flaw. Okay, but usually we go through the MSOL library to interactively obtain that token. Now with confidential, we're going to rely on the code flow we saw in the earlier slides. Okay. All right. So this is the Node.js single page app. Okay. Now there's also samples and that targeting Angular, targeting React. Okay. I decided to show the most basic one. So this is good old plain old JavaScript. Okay. All right. So in this sample code, we start with configuring the client ID. Okay. This client ID is also registered with Azure AD. Sample browser MSOL. Now it's imperative that in order for my app to work with this system, I must allow both access token and ID token to be implicitly granted to the app. Okay. Now this is critical for single page app to work. Okay. You must have access token and ID token to be granted at the same time. Okay. API permissions. This is how I added the MSOL app to the API I'm building. So I'm saying that this app is allowed to impersonate user to query user's own balance. Okay. Now, if I want to grant more permission, I can click on Add Permission and select my APIs and say, I would like to also grant it query all. But notice if I grant that, an administrator, global admin of the directory must consent it. So he must come here and press that button. Okay. Now this MSOL app doesn't have any API to expose. And in the manifest, okay, you also have to declare what type of application we're dealing with. Okay. So this is the reply URL with the type. So it says your app is going to run on that URL, and it's a single page app. Okay. So what happened is when I sign on to this page, okay, my index.html will offer a sign in. Okay. And that sign in offers two choices, using a pop-up or an in-page redirect. It's just purely user experience. So either way, the user will sign in. Okay, since it looks like I've already signed in. Okay. I really should sign up. Okay. All right. So as soon as I click on the sign in, I'm forwarded to Azure AD. And Azure AD now knows someone's coming. Specifically, to sign user in, read their profile, and this is the app that sent the user. And if the user is authenticated, reply the token back there. Okay. All right. So the rest is unimportant. So I'm going to sign in now. Now notice the request at this point is only to sign user in. Okay. I have a C profile, which goes to Microsoft Graph to retrieve my profile information. I have a read mails, which goes ahead and download my email. Okay, great. Is that my email? Okay, that is it. Okay, why am I showing my email? Okay, so okay. And then finally, this is calling my own backend API. And notice this is echoing back my own credential. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at how this page. So whenever you click on C profile, this MSO object will call the get token. And once the token is obtained, now remember, this is what the MSOL.js for browser does. Okay. You can look at the configuration as well as instantiation of this public client application. This is a plain old JavaScript object, okay, public client application with the MSAL config, and the config came from this authconfig.js, basically just RID. Now this get accounts, okay, quickly. Okay, this again use acquired token silent. So in other words, if the user has already logged on, this thing will be completely silent. But if there's any reason, for example, the user is requesting a token that the user hasn't consent to, okay, or the identity of the app has changed, this acquired token silent will then throw an exception, and it becomes, notice we're using the error handling. Okay, the silent acquisition fails, then we'll do a pop-up to ask for more consent. Okay. All right. So the end result of this function call is to obtain a token. That token is then used to call Microsoft Graph to call my own API. Okay, and the result will simply update the user interface with the result of the call. And this is, once again, get token pop-up, and there are various token requests. Okay. Depends on whether we are trying to read user's profile, or read bank account, or read email account. So each one of these is a different token request. Okay. All right. Now all this code can be found in the auth.js. All right. Now keep in mind that this example uses the MSOL.js. Okay. Now on the chat window, this is where you can find this repository. So if you are downloading this, there is the backend API, public client, and confidential client. Okay. All right. Hopefully we're okay so far. All right. So this first JavaScript-based application, we sign user in with Azure AD account. We obtain the access token interactively, and then we save the token in session storage. Send the access token when we invoke the API. Okay. All right. And in the web API, we use the middleware to find out what is the user's identity so we can return the bank account. So notice, because of these authorized, we're able to unwrap the JWT token and reconstruct the original users. Now, remember, this is original user's identity, not the web app, whether or not the single page app. Okay, so understand that because the token is obtained by the user, the web app is simply behave or on behalf. So they are just sending that token on behalf of the user. All right. Now the third app that you'll find is a ASP.NET Core Web API. Okay. Now I sort of know that I will be pressured by time based on the amount of material I'm trying to get through. This MSO web app is using a brand new library that just became available April, earlier this month. Okay, so this is now a package that wraps around the MSO.NET. So there are some things that MSO.NET offers, but it's pretty difficult and tedious to program against, right? That two library essentially wraps around MSO to make it a little bit easier. All right. Now, before we move on to the web app side, I still got about 8 minutes or so. Check out AAD B2C. Okay, so if you want your customer to be able to sign in as Google, Facebook, Twitter, the last thing you want to do is to have your app. So let's say here's your app. The last thing you want to do is to have your app talk directly with all the other providers. And the reason being is, imagine you're writing another app, another app, another app, another app. You have to repeat this integration in all of those apps. And if something changes, you have to change in 5 to 10 different places. All right, so with Azure AD B2C, all of your app depends on one identity source. And the B2C integrates with all the other providers. So that if there's any scenario where you need to add more provider or remove existing provider, you do it in one place. Okay. So take a look at B2C if that's what you want. All right. So the last demo I have for the last 5 minutes is the ASP.NET Core end-to-end. Okay. So this is the last part of that demo. Okay. Now this web app uses add web app call to protected app, and that is offered through that Microsoft Identity.web library, and it is requesting this permission to be made available. Okay. And it will store them in a distributed cache. And once again, we have to make sure the authentication and authorization challenges are made to the interactive user. Okay. So here's my MSOL-based web app. Permissions are granted both to read my email as well as call my backend API. Now notice I did not grant this admin permission, nor am I actually showing this. Okay, but I did add the permission, so this web app with this identity can, on behalf of interactive user, obtain a token to access this API. All right. Okay. In the authentication section, now notice this is my actual website URL. And you'll notice I'm not using implicit grant here because this is not a single page app. My web app must also prove its identity. So I don't need access token to be issued implicitly. I do need ID token though. Every app needs ID token, really. Okay, so be mindful. I really think the user interface should put a line here because you really always need ID token as long as you're signing people in. Okay, so I'm gonna, right now I'm not signed in, so I'm gonna click on sign in. Okay. Now this is all the information available from a JWT. Also known as the ID token. So I'm simply parsing out all the things in the ID token and print them out. To see the profile and read the email, which will be pretty much the same set of data, okay, as well as calling the backend API, my app has to go out, prove its identity. So you notice in the app settings, now this is a really bad thing because I'm putting the client secret out in the public. Okay, so if you're coming back to this and you want to read your own email, no problem. Okay, so this is the client ID. This is my tenant ID. Okay, and it's my client secret used to exchange the authorization code with an access token. So when I try to access, for example, the profile, my Razor page will instantiate Graph Service Client by making use of an injected iToken acquisition object. Now that iToken acquisition object is provided by the Microsoft Identity.web, which is a wrapper of the MSOL.net. And once again, this one calls get access token for user. It reads the scope it wants to obtain. If the user has not granted the scope, this is the time user will be prompted, do you consent this app to access your data? So for profile, I just need user.read. And if I can obtain that token, I can go ahead and use that. Now to access the bank account backend API, I do pretty much the same thing, except my scope now has to be query on. All right, and once I got the access token, the rest is really straightforward. I think you all can recognize this code. Get an HTTP client, add a bears token, and just simply send the requests. Now the access Outlook mail will be pretty similar. So you'll need a scope called mail.read. Get a token and use the authenticated client to access Microsoft Graph endpoint to pull back top 10 email messages. All right. All right. So understand that the msol.net is a lower level library. So it's written for JS, it's written for Python, it's written for Java, it's written for .NET. Okay. So it has to stay somewhat of a low level thing. Now to actually make it easy to implement, okay, the Microsoft.identity.web is the ASP.NET Core platform implementation. Okay, so if your primary stack is, say, Python or JavaScript, okay, you may want to look at your stack to see if there is a wrapper for the msol.net. Okay. All right, so the Microsoft.identity.web makes life a lot easier when you integrate your web app. Okay, so for example, it can easily sign in users, call protected web APIs, and cache token in different data stores. All right, so, all right. Okay. All right, so folks, other things that you may want to take a look. Okay, there are a bunch of other additional things you can do with the Microsoft Identity. You can take a look at it and see if you want to find one that works on your stack. All right, so folks, I want to open up the floor for questioning. I know we've been running really quick and trying to squeeze a lot of things in that was 1 hour. So this is the time where I want to open up the floor to let everyone let me know if you have any question, any parts that went by too fast. I mean, the whole thing is really, really jam-packed. But if you have any questions about the code, okay, about the workflows, about Azure AD, this is a great time to ask away. And I'm live. Go ahead, guys, take it away. I think the audio may have been self-muted. I think there is an option that you can raise hands. You can do the chat here. I just realized my last chat went to just the organizer. Okay, so folks, that is the GitHub library that I was referring to. Okay. All right. Now, folks, if there's anything that I went through that you're curious about, for example, you've been working with WebAPI and go, well, what is all these things? If there's any
Hey, Victor.
Yes.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
You showed us one of the Azure ADB2C, where one application or multiple application actually connecting to ADB2C, and then it's connecting to different providers like Google, LinkedIn, Twitter, etc.
Correct.
Right? how do they connect? I mean, Azure AD B2C also need to have some sort of handshaking between
Okay,
these applications so that they know how they are behaving.
right. Good question. So folks, what I just did is I switched my directory in my portal. So I switched to a B2C directory so I can show you. Okay. So this is a business to consumer directory. Now, one of the things that you are going to find interesting is that in the B2C directory, I can customize user's identity. So here's my user, right? Right now, my directory only has one user. Okay. I can customize the attributes. I can add as many attributes as I like. And I can federate with identity providers centrally. Okay. So these are the out-of-the-box one. And I have 3 configurations so far. This is if you want to create an account with this directory. So you'll be a local account. Okay. You can also sign in with Google. You can also sign in with Amazon. This directory is configured centrally. And I will set up a user flow policy. So I may create a flow that signs up user and signs in user. And I'll call this app A. App A will support all 3. And app A will collect which profile and will return what profile in the JWT itself. So in other words, the app will receive job title, the app will receive phone, make, and model, right? So let's say you're selling phones, right? And we will collect the country region and return it, okay? And we'll collect postal code for marketing or type of places to sell my phones, okay? So I can customize this for this application, okay? So now there's a workflow for app A. Now I can create another workflow for app B, for app C, for app D. Now understand however many workflow, all the users will be stored in one central place. So I may have 6 different e-commerce websites, and there's now a single directory that's supporting all of them. So you visit one, you sign up once, you can visit any other one and sign in single sign-on. And you could try to run the user flow. And once again, you could customize all the user interfaces. Okay. This is the OpenID configuration, what will be returned. All right. And I actually have to have a proper application register for this. Okay. Now, each one of these workflow allows customization to make it look exactly like part of your website. Okay, so you can customize the sign-in instead of something that looks like a Microsoft thing. All right. And remember, I configure all these identity provider centrally. So in other words, I can add more OpenID Connect provider if I want. Okay. But I configure them once here. Since there's no verification, I'm just typing something. Well, I guess there is verification. Okay. So once this is all configured, you would then create a workflow. So for application B, I'm going to use that. And no Amazon there. And perhaps do an MFA. And what attribute do I want to collect during the sign up process? And what claims I want to return when user signs in. So now this B2C can support a large number of applications that want to develop without my application having to do point-to-point integration. Does that answer your question?
Oh, yes. A great explanation. But this service, Azure AD B2C, is a paid service which we have to purchase and integrate with our application.
Correct. Now, here's the thing. For most of the website that does not have a whole lot of traffic, okay, the very first 50,000 active users are all free. So usually, unless you're really doing this for a commercial scale, Microsoft would more or less let you use it for free. So for 50,000, and I think it allows sign-in for a few million, I think, before you even have to start paying for them. So it's 50,000 monthly active users.
Yeah.
Yep.
Great. And then the user information, which is stored in AD instance, are all compliant with, let's say, GDPR or any other.
That is correct.
Law.
That is correct. There is export my data option. There's also remove all my data options. Now, what is really important is that when you create this B2C tenant, you need to specify what country it operates on. So it will give you the correct feature based on the locality of the B2C. So for example, if you want GDPR feature to show up automatically, then you must run this in a European region. So that's one thing you should be aware of. Yep. Yes, there is a GDPR compliance option. Now, on top of my head, I can't remember where to go to that link. I think it's myapps.microsoft.com, where the end users can remove their data, export their data, etc. So I think you may have to give this a little bit digging around. Yep.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, unless and until that option is present, it's absolutely.
Yes, it is compliant to the standard. I know for certain that GDPR works because I have a few clients that actually use this on their e-commerce website operating in Europe. So,
Great, thank you.
Excellent question. Excellent questions. Yeah. Cool. All right, folks. Any other questions? I'm happy to stay around to answer any and all questions you have. Kind of fun to answer your questions. I know we're cramming a lot of information in this 1 hour time, so definitely check out the source code. Okay, just both the API and the front ends are there. So my app is multi-tenant, so that means you could actually sign in with your own tenancy and Microsoft account and run through these. So. All right. Wow, it's just realized 45 minutes an hour to talk about this is a lot of information. Oh. All right, so folks, before we wrap this up, one last call, final call. Does anyone have any things they aren't 100% clear about? Good time to ask away.
Hi, Victor. Would
Yes,
you be able to share the recording because I've missed parts of it?
Sure. This session will be recorded, so there will be a recorded session, and I'm certain that the the proctor of this session will send the recording out to everyone. And as the person has stated earlier, this whole session is recorded, and you will be able to come back to Skill Me Up to review this recorded session at any time.
Thank you.
And that also means we missed telling you that, yes, this session is recorded. So all the questions that you may have gets to get answered. Cool. All right. Okay. All right. Yes, it is recorded. Okay. All right. So folks, thank you very much for your time today. And to summarize everything, folks, OpenID and OAuth are mature technologies. There's very little reason not to integrate them. And it is something that you can integrate directly into your code. And one last thing, okay. To address these cross-cutting concerns, there's one other service you might want to take a look. It's called API management. Okay, so API management is a gateway to your APIs. Okay, so what we saw earlier, where our web API verifies the scope and provide access, with an API management, you can delegate that token verification and scope verification into the API management. So check that out. It's an expensive service, but I think it's well worth it. All right. Thank you guys for spending the time today on a nice Friday, and keep the question coming, and have fun working on these web API security topics. Thank you very much, folks.